Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So our first breakout session is going to be on addressing invasive species with citizen science. Invasive species are the #2 threat to biodiversity, second only to habitat loss. The effects of invasive species are increasingly evident on Wisconsin's landscape. But the good news is gardeners can be an important part of the efforts of scientists who are working to minimize the impact and spread of invasive species in Wisconsin. So we're really pleased to have Pearce with us today, who coordinates the Wisconsin's First Detector Network. The network is a citizen science group that empowers people to take action against invasive species through education and volunteer opportunities. She's also a member of the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin's Board of Directors, and she leads restoration volunteer work parties at the UW-Madison Arboretum. Thank you, Anne, for joining us today.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. I know it's a beautiful day, at least here in southern Wisconsin, so it's a little tough to be stuck inside, but lots of great information to learn today. So today I'm going to talk a bit about invasive species, but rather than focusing on, what might be the invasive plants that you have in your yard, what are the good plants versus bad plants, I really want to just give an overview of what plants are generally considered to be invasive or what makes something an invasive plant, and then try to encourage people to think about what are the impacts of the plants that you have in your yards, those impacts beyond your yards, and how can you potentially minimize or mitigate some of those impacts through choices that you make with what you plant in your yard and through actions outside of your yard as well. And so as Becky said, I coordinate the Wisconsin First Detector Network. We're a citizen science, or also known as a community science program. And so that means that a lot of our work is focused on training volunteers, people who are not necessarily quote unquote professional scientists, to share their observations of invasive species with us and with each other so that we can increase our knowledge of invasive species in the state and across the country. And throughout the presentation, I'll give some examples of how we use that knowledge. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to start out with some definitions. So let's start with weeds and think, what is a weed? So the most basic definition is it's a plant out of place. And obviously that is very subjective. One person's weed is another person's treasured native pollinator plant. Weeds can be native or non-native species. And when we make that distinction between native and non-native, that could be a whole nother kind of debate or lesson on what's native versus non-native. But generally what we say is that a species is native if it was present here in Wisconsin at the time of European settlement, and it's non-native if it's arrived after. And typically our non-native plants have been introduced into Wisconsin because of activities of humans. And then these non-native plants, when they arrive here or wherever they arrive, where they haven't been growing, they can be considered either casual or naturalized. So casual non-native plants are those that need our help to persist. So the tulips that you plant in your yard, those are non-native plants, but they're not really going to persist on the landscape unless we as gardeners continually plant them. Naturalized non-native plants, though, are those that can persist without human intervention once they've arrived in a new area. So all of that is basically to get us to the point of what actually is an invasive plant. And those are naturalized non-native plants. So plants that weren't here in Wisconsin at the time of European settlement, and now they are here and they're persisting on their own. They're also, another characteristic of invasive plants is that they're growing or spreading rapidly. So not every naturalized non-native plant is an invasive plant. There are plenty of naturalized non-native plants that persist, but they don't grow or spread rapidly. They're not really problematic. And then that third major characteristic of an invasive plant is it causes or has potential to cause harm. And that could be economic harm, including harm to recreational activities. It could be environmental harm or harm to human or animal health. And so I'll point out that native plants can also act really aggressively and be problematic in our gardens and out in the natural world. But the definition that I share here with invasive plants is kind of what the Wisconsin DNR and other natural resources agencies working on these issues accept as the definition of invasive. So non-native, growing or spreading rapidly, and cause or potentially cause harm. So when you're thinking about the plants in your yard or garden, or if you're hiking out in the woods, how can you tell if something might be invasive? And I'm gonna put this in terms of, how we might hear about plants described as gardeners. And this is not in any way to knock the horticulture industry, because I know Xana just gave a great presentation on lots of options, but it is just to get you to think a little bit about plant choices. And notice that I emphasize might. So if a plant has these characteristics, it doesn't mean it is invasive, it just means it might be. And so something that is considered a great ground cover might be something that spreads really aggressively. And so Bishop Scoutweed is an example of one of those ground cover plants that certainly covers the ground very well, but it is an invasive plant and a regulated invasive plant in the state of Wisconsin. Something that's advertised as having food for birds could potentially have lots of seeds. Again, on its own, that characteristic isn't necessarily bad, but it is a characteristic that is shared by a lot of our invasive plants, including our invasive thistles. Something that makes a living fence might be thicket forming. So like our bush honeysuckle species are basically the honeysuckles that have arrived from Europe and Asia. They make a great fence, but when they escape into the woods, that thicket that they form causes lots of problems. So just thinking a little bit about how these plants might act differently outside of our yards. Something that stays green longer could be great in your yard, but if it escapes into a natural area, that shifted phenology, or with phenology meaning the life stages of the plant, can really impact the other plants around it. So something like common buckthorn that greens up earlier in the spring and stays green longer in the fall than pretty much any of our native plants can really do a lot of damage by shading out those plants. And because it's green for longer, it can be really competitive and outcompete those native plants. The sea of blooms. So purple loosestrife is a highly invasive wetland plant, and it's beautiful. There's no doubt about that. And pollinators use it. And so you're wondering, like, why is it bad if pollinators use it? But I want you to take a look at this picture, and I know it's a little blurry, but all you see is purple loosestrife. And so if you are a pollinating insect that relies on flowers to get your nectar to survive, this wetland is going to be great right now when these flowers are blooming. But purple loosestrife will only bloom for maybe a month out of the year. And so where are you supposed to go for the other months that you need to collect nectar if you're a pollinator? So the kind of analogy that I use to help bring this home is, it would be like saying that this purple loosestrife is good for pollinators. It would be the equivalent of getting a puppy and saying that if you only feed it in the month of July, that's going to be good enough. And obviously that doesn't make any sense. You know that puppy won't survive if you only feed it 1 month of the year. So when we're thinking about flowers in our yard, we want to think about having a variety of species to support pollinators throughout the year, and thinking about those impacts if they escape into natural areas and create these monocultures. How much might we be damaging the ecosystems that those pollinators rely on? And then winter interest. A lot of our plants that we plant, our shrubs for winter interest, have lots of fruits on them, which is great, but that's not always good if it's an invasive plant, because that means birds are eating those fruits and spreading them into natural areas. So Japanese barberry, really popular ornamental shrub. Some cultivars are regulated as invasive in the state of Wisconsin, particularly the cultivars that produce a lot of fruits, because this is one that has a lot of really negative impacts when it escapes. And so I've kind of talked through some of these impacts already, But just to reiterate some of the problems, these thicket forming shrubs, when they get into the forest, can actually reduce tree regeneration. So eventually we're going to see fewer larger trees because the little baby seedlings and saplings can't get established under these invasive shrubs. These shrubs like honeysuckle and barberry, when they make thickets in forests, also support higher tick populations. So Wisconsin's already kind of a hotspot for Lyme disease, so that's something that we're definitely concerned about. I already just talked about this, that the longer growth period shades out other species and gives a competitive advantage. So that just helps these shrubs make a thicket and create the problems I just talked about. Talked about the poor pollinator habitat. And then the other thing I was going to mention about these fleshy fruits, even if birds are eating the fruits, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good for them. So most of our non-native fruits don't have the proper nutrition for the birds. A lot of these non-native fruits that are out in the fall are lower in fat content than some of our native shrub fruits like dogwoods. And so if you're thinking of these tiny little songbirds that are trying to get ready for migration in the fall and they're fattening up on fruits, if there's not enough fat in there, it's not going to give them the proper nutrition. Common buckthorn's another great example. Birds will eat it if it's the only thing around, but it gives them diarrhea. So it's certainly not helping them nutrition-wise. So like I said, those are some things that indicate that a species might be invasive. Here in Wisconsin, though, you might be wondering, okay, so which species are actually considered invasive? And we have a law on the book in Wisconsin called NR 40, so it's chapter 40 in the Natural Resources Administrative Code if you want to go dig into it. But basically, it's meant to provide education about invasive species with the goal of preventing introduction of new species and the spread of species that are already here in the state. And there's over 200 species on this list, and they're classified either as prohibited species or restricted species. And I'm going to go over that briefly because there are kind of legal regulations here that it's good to be aware of as gardeners who are working with a lot of plants and selecting plants for our yards. So prohibited species are those that either aren't in the state yet or they're only in very small stands. And so it's possible that we can kind of keep them eradicated statewide. And then here are the regulations. So you can't move them around, you can't buy or sell them, you can't introduce them. And then I've highlighted in red that you can't possess these species either. So legally, the DNR can force you to remove a prohibited species from your property if you have it. Restricted species are those that are already here, already pretty widespread. They might not be everywhere in the state, but we're certainly not going to eradicate them at a statewide level. And the regulations are pretty much the same. You are encouraged to manage all of these species, but you are legally allowed to possess restricted species. And so just a couple examples. On the left is our, what I call the poster child of a prohibited species. It's kudzu, which is also known as the plant that swallowed the South. We do not yet have it in Wisconsin, but we know it's a highly damaging plant. And so it's on our regulated list because it's likely it will show up in Wisconsin. It's already in Northern Illinois, so it's on its way. And by having it on the list, that means as soon as we find it in Wisconsin, we have a legal mechanism to deal with it and eradicate it before it becomes the plant that swallowed Wisconsin. On the right, we have what I consider the poster child of restricted species. Might be familiar to many of you, and this is garlic mustard. So we have it all over the state. Here in southern Wisconsin, it's pretty much everywhere. Up north, there are definitely areas that don't have garlic mustard yet. So this one, we're never going to get rid of it out of Wisconsin totally, but it's still good to manage it locally. And so if you want to take a look at the list of species that are regulated to see if you have any of those in your yard or to check it against a list of plants you're considering buying, you can find that at the DNR's website. So moving on to more of the, instead of the like, here are all the bad things, let's move on to what can we actually do about these invasive species. And we'll start with thinking about our own yards. So one first step is to try to choose native plants. If you're planting new plants in your yard or replacing plants, think about choosing native plants. And one of the big reasons for this is to support wildlife. So although I spend my day job life thinking about plants, at heart, I'm a birder. I was out birding this morning, so I care a lot about supporting birds in my yard and in my neighborhood. And so thinking about how our plants impact what birds are around, native plants support many times more insects than non-native plants. And birds, especially in the spring when they're raising their young, are relying on lots of juicy caterpillars to fatten up their nestlings. They're not really eating a lot of seeds in the spring once they've started breeding, and once they're taking care of their nestlings, they're trying to get all those juicy caterpillars. And so Doug Tallamy, who is an entomology professor at the University of Delaware, he and his lab have done a bunch of research on kind of suburban and urban yards and what plants are there and what insects those plants are supporting, and in turn how that is impacting the bird populations. And he has a couple of books. One's called Bringing Nature Home. Then the more recent one, I can't recall the title at the moment. I think it's Nature's Best Hope or something like that, but basically just promoting planting native plants. So as an example, oak trees, if you plant a native oak, they can typically support over 500 species of insects. And you might be thinking like, oh gosh, insects are bad. But these are just insects that are naturally occurring on the oaks. They're not heavily damaging them. They're not problematic for humans. But what they are doing is supporting birds and other wildlife. Versus a non-native ginkgo species, which we see planted. I mean, I live in the city of Madison. It's a really popular street tree. They don't really support any insects at all. And so if you're thinking about trying to help out birds, maybe don't plant 5 ginkgos in your yard, maybe plant 1 ginkgo and then think about some native trees as well. And so if you're not sure how to go about buying native plants, there are nurseries that specifically focus on native plants. There are nurseries that carry a lot of native plant stock as well as other plants. Ask about where the plants are coming from. And then there are online tools that can help you select non-invasive plants that are appropriate for your area. So the National Wildlife Foundation teamed up with Doug Tallamy and his lab to create a native plant finder website where you can just enter your zip code and then it will show you a range of native plant species, both herbaceous, so more flowers, and then woody plants, or shrubs and trees that support pollinating insects, particularly focused on butterflies and moths. And it will tell you which butterflies and moths those species support. So if you want lots of butterflies in your yard, along with birds, that's a really fun tool to look at. Another thing we can think about as gardeners is being really mindful about sharing plants. And as an aside, we're not even talking about jumping worms in this presentation, but that's another reason to be careful about sharing plants, because it's very easy to spread the invasive jumping worms. But again, those plants that are really aggressive, those ground covers like our periwinkle or vinca in the upper right, or again, that goutweed in the background, not a good idea to share those really aggressive plants, particularly for folks that live near natural areas where it's very easy for these plants to spread into the ground layer and outcompete and kind of eliminate the native plants. And so if you've got goutweed and you're trying to get it out of part of your yard, or other invasive plants, figure out how you can dispose of those properly. A lot of these plants you really shouldn't put in the compost because they might just spread from root fragments within the compost if you use your compost elsewhere in your yard, or if there are seeds present. Usually home compost systems don't get to high enough temperatures to make those seeds inviable, so you can spread weedy or invasive plant seeds in your compost as well. So often disposing of them properly means burning them if you have that ability, or in the state of Wisconsin, if you have a regulated invasive plant like bishop's goutweed or garlic mustard, you are legally able to just bag those up and dispose of them in a landfill. Also think about controlling invasive plants on your property. Even if you have a plant that looks like it's not being a problem on your property, again, keep in mind that what you do in your yard can impact what happens elsewhere. And particularly if you live adjacent to a natural area, or if you have invasive shrubs with lots of berries and you live within bird flying distance of a natural area, you can really do a lot to help prevent those big impacts. And I will show you later, but through UW Extension, we have a series of fact sheets that give recommendations for both non-chemical and chemical control options for our most common invasive plant species. So then beyond your yard, that's where we're going to get more into our citizen science or community science opportunities. And I want to start out by explaining a bit more about how invasions, particularly plant invasions, typically occur, to explain kind of why the First Detector Network exists and what we're trying to do with our volunteer group. So on this graph, on the left side, going from the bottom to the top, that will represent the amount of area infested by the plant. And then time is going from left to right across the bottom. And so at the time of introduction, obviously if a plant has just arrived, it's infesting a very low amount of area. We typically, however, don't notice these plants or new infestations until they're kind of on this upward swing in terms of expanding their infested area pretty rapidly. And then the general public typically doesn't become aware of these species until that upward swing has already happened. The area infested is already pretty large, maybe still growing, but not by a lot. And so what we're trying to do with the First Detector Network is help more people become aware of invasive plants and be able to recognize which plants or other species are invasive, to move our detection earlier in this curve, meaning that we can detect these species when there are fewer of them, they're infesting a lower area, and that also means that the cost to control them or manage them is much, much lower. And so the primary kind of ongoing project that we've had with the First Detector Network is reporting invasive plants, so mapping them, letting us know where you've seen them. And I know, looking through the participants list, I know that there's at least a handful of people joining us today that are already pretty familiar with WIFDN and what we do. But we're trying to map these plants for a couple of different reasons. One is so we can have a really good idea of where they are in the state and where they're spreading, so that areas of the state that don't have the plants yet kind of know what's coming their way and can prepare for it. We also use these invasive plant reports for research purposes. And then we partner with land managing groups or friends groups at county and state parks. And when they map their invasive species, or have volunteers help map their invasive species, when they have a really good map of invasive plants on a single property, that helps the land managers and volunteers develop a really effective plan for controlling the invasive plants. And so we take reports of any and all invasive species, even that garlic mustard that's everywhere, but occasionally we'll send out alerts for really high priority species as well. And so you'll be getting a handout from George after today that has a bit more information about reporting, but there is a smartphone app called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, or GLEDN app, that you can use to report, or you can simply send an email to our program. And basically, if you're letting us know that you found an invasive plant, we just want to know what species it is, the date you saw it, where you saw it, so GPS coordinates if possible, and then send us a photo or two so that we can verify the identification. Another opportunity that we have monitoring for invasive insects is what we call our Wasp Watchers project. You might be wondering, like, I don't know if I want to get involved with wasps. That sounds dangerous. But it's actually a really cool project that helps us find emerald ash borer, which is probably a pretty familiar invasive insect to a lot of us. and relatives of emerald ash borer that have not yet been found in the state, but are kind of equally damaging wood-boring invasive insects. And so how it works is that there is a native stingless wasp called Cerceris, or the smoky winged beetle bandit, and it actually captures emerald ash borer and its relatives to provision its nests. And it has these nests underground in sandy areas like baseball fields. And so for a long time, the folks working on emerald ash borer research didn't have a very good trap for emerald ash borer to see where it was. So this has actually been a really kind of one of our best ways to detect emerald ash borer, is to find these wasp nests from the Cerceris wasp and then visit the site when the wasps are most active from about June to September, and then collect beetles that they've dropped by the nests. And so this is a project that had been going with WIFTN and the USDA for a few years, and then it kind of was on pause for a couple of years, but we're bringing it back this year. This is a great project for kids and families because it really just amounts to like going to your local baseball field, walking around, looking for the nests, and then collecting beetles if you find them, and sending in beetles at the end of the summer. So if you're interested in more about that, we are going to have a webinar on April 28th to talk more about this project and the insects that we're looking for. And we'll be recording that as well. So if you can't attend live, you can watch it later. Another invasive insect project that we're starting this year is monitoring for spotted lanternfly, which is this really beautiful insect that you can see the pictures of on the right side of the screen. Highly, highly damaging though. If you have heard any spotted lanternfly news out of Pennsylvania, which I keep track of it, I don't expect that everybody does. This insect is everywhere. And whereas emerald ash borer targets ash trees specifically and doesn't really damage other species of trees, spotted lanternfly damages a really wide range of tree species. So maples, grapevines, a lot of our fruit trees. So definitely folks that have fruit orchards are really concerned about this. And emerald ash borer bores into the wood, it damages the tree that way. These spotted lanternflies actually suck the sap out of the wood. And so if there's enough of them kind of feeding on the sap of the trees, that can be enough to damage or kill the tree. But having all those holes where the insect is feeding also can introduce fungal diseases that kill trees and woody plants. So the interesting thing about spotted lanternfly is it has not yet been found in Wisconsin. So we're really kind of just ramping up efforts now to keep an eye out for it. But the other interesting part of it is that its preferred host plant, even though it will feed on a number of different plants, its preferred plant for laying its eggs in particular is tree of heaven, which is itself an invasive plant. And so we know we have tree of heaven here in Wisconsin, but kind of our two-part plan for spotted lanternfly monitoring this year is first to try to get a really good map of where we have tree of heaven in Wisconsin. And so using those same reporting guidelines that I mentioned a couple slides ago, we want to get a good map and know exactly where individual tree of heaven trees exist, so that the second part of our monitoring, which is looking for the spotted lanternfly itself, can happen in a more guided fashion. Of course, you can just keep an eye out in your yard. These spotted lanternflies will certainly, they'll feed on trees in your yard as well. We're not just going to find them in forests. They can show up anywhere. But if we know where tree of heaven is, we can specifically kind of keep an eye on those tree of heaven plants to look for the spotted lanternfly. And we actually don't have much information about how far north tree of heaven exists. So we suspect that at some point as we get further north in Wisconsin, it's going to be too cold for tree of heaven and potentially for spotted lanternfly, but we really don't know. So that's one big question we're trying to answer with the Citizen Science Project this summer in mapping the invasive tree of heaven. So we're also going to have a webinar about this project with more information, more background on these insects and how to identify the tree of heaven and the insects, and that will be on April 14th. Of course, there's lots of opportunities to volunteer to remove invasive plants. And I know for those of you who are Master Gardener volunteers, you're looking to kind of maintain your volunteer hours. So these citizen science opportunities would count towards that as well. But if you're ever interested in learning more about removing invasive plants or getting involved, it's usually not too hard to find volunteer opportunities. COVID has changed that a little bit, but I can also certainly connect you with groups in your area if you're interested in that. And then just a reminder that when you're out recreating or even gardening, especially if you use the same tools gardening at home that you might when you're volunteering at another garden site, to make sure to clean your gear. I think a lot of people in Wisconsin are really familiar with this Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers campaign that reminds you to clean, drain, and dry your boat and your aquatic gear. There's a similar campaign kind of focused more on those of us that like to dig in the dirt, which is Play, Clean, Go. But it's really just that reminder, like, once you're done playing, whether that's gardening or hiking or walking your dog or biking or ATVing, make sure that you clean your stuff. So your shoes, your gloves, your pet's fur, your tools, before you go on to the next site. Because a lot of our invasive plants can spread by seeds, which easily get stuck in dirt and mud, or even from tiny fragments of the plant itself. So if you've even got tiny pieces of roots or shoots of some of these invasive plants, if you bring them to another site, they can start new infestations. And the same goes for those jumping worms as well. Like, the jumping worm cocoons just look like dirt. And so it's very easy to transport them if we're not keeping a close eye on our tools and gear and cleaning it well before we go to a new place. And then finally, you can do what you're doing today, which is learning more and share some of this information with other people. And so I just threw a lot of options at you. I said, like, here are 4 things you can do in your yard. Here are 6 things you can do outside of your yard. And I certainly don't expect that everybody will be like, all right, I'm signing up for everything. But I just hope that people will consider at least one of the things that we talked about today, and think a bit more about how the plants we put in our yards impacts what happens elsewhere. And before I finish up, I just wanted to leave you with some resources about invasive plants that will hopefully help answer any questions you might have after today. So if you're interested in more information about identification and management, you can find that on our First Detector Network website, which this website and the link to it will be included in the handout that George will send after today. But for ID and management, on the right side of our homepage, you can click on I want to access fact sheets and ID videos. And so you'll see a table like this. The ID videos are just 2 to 3 minute YouTube videos that show one of our extension staff members showing you the plant, where it's growing out in the world, and pointing out the best characteristics to look for to identify it. And then these extension fact sheets have identification information on the front page, and then a series of really detailed recommendations for management. And I mentioned this earlier, there's both non-chemical control recommendations and chemical control recommendations for, I think it's 35 or so species that we have these fact sheets for. Another resource I want to point out is our invasive species calendar, which helps you kind of figure out when to look for different invasive plants. So of the 200 plus regulated invasive species in Wisconsin, over 100 of those are terrestrial plants. So, and many of those are species that can definitely grow in our yards. So the invasive species calendar, basically each row just has a species and each column is a month of the year. And the color of the circle for a month shows the dominant life stage of that species. So kind of color coded there. And then how full the circle is shows its detectability. So if the circle is completely empty, that means it's not detectable in that month. So it's not really worth your effort to look for it. But if the circle is completely filled in with color, that means that that species is kind of in that month, the easiest time to detect it. So I'll kind of highlight this row that I'm moving my laser pointer over is our garlic mustard. So full circles from kind of April to July. So that's going to be a great time to keep an eye out for garlic mustard in your yard or other areas. And you can also use these drop-down menus to kind of customize your view. So you could choose your habitat, which could include, for those of you that live in more urban or suburban areas, you can select the urban option, and that'll give you the list of species that could very well show up in your yard. Could narrow it by month, but basically shrink down that chart that will show you species that would be of most interest to you or species that you would be most likely to find. And you can find this at our website as well. And again, the handout will have more information, but it's under our tools tab. And then finally, I wanted to share what we call our WISTIP viewer. So Wisconsin Shared Terrestrial Invasive Plant Presence Viewer. It's just an interactive map that we host online. And this will show you all of the known verified reports of invasive plants that we have in the state of Wisconsin. And so it's not a complete picture. Like, these holes in the map don't mean that there aren't invasive plants there. It just likely means that we don't have volunteer reporters or DNR has not surveyed those areas. We do our best to bring in data from like local parks, county parks agencies, other groups that kind of have their own databases of invasive plant records. But this is another interactive map. So you can use these menus. So you could select common name and just see like, oh, where is Japanese barberry invasive near me? Like, has it escaped? Or Japanese knotweed is a really nasty invasive that is really difficult to deal with and grows through concrete and grows through foundations. You can see if that's near you. And you can also zoom in on the map to your area to kind of see everything that's been mapped. And again, more information about that will be in the handout, but it's another one that's in our tools tab. So thanks for joining us again this morning. I think we'll have a bit of time for questions if there are any. But if you have questions about what is this plant in my yard that might be invasive, or how do I get rid of this plant, definitely feel free to get in touch. Happy to help as much as we can.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was a great presentation. As a community at war with garlic mustard, among other invasives, I'm sure many folks online today really appreciate the work that you all do.